Thank you, Innocent, first for coming and helping us strengthen the ties with AARC, which is really nice. So I think the partnership with AARC and RENAPRI are very important partnerships for ReSAKSS, and we look forward to strengthening and deepening them. Lulama was saying the future belongs to those who prepare for it. Part of the preparation is knowing where you are and where you came from and what your strengths and your weaknesses are. So I'll be talking about the economic transformation process in African countries from independence to now, and not just its patterns, but the drivers of it and what that implies for future growth strategies. The outline, I will briefly describe the structural transformation process. Then I'll talk about the role of agriculture in structural change in that process. Then I discuss the patterns a little bit before talking about what it implies for future growth and poverty reduction. Allow me to start with this. As economies move from low per capita income to high income, agricultural GDP growth and agricultural GDP per worker grows. We didn't have that until recently, but this is the normal process of growth taking place. Yet, despite the growth in GDP and agricultural GDP per capita, we often notice that both the share of employment in agriculture and the share of agriculture in GDP decline. Okay? So now the decline in these two shares, So the green lines, the red lines show how agricultural GDP and GDP per capita grow as countries move from low to high income, and how the share of agriculture in GDP and employment decline. The two green lines are really what matters the most in terms of their behavior. As you see, employment shares fall much faster than GDP share, and when those two meet, basically incomes in the rural areas equalize with income in the rest of the economy on average. That's what you would like to see, rural incomes going up to equalize with the rest of the economy. That convergence process is equally important, extremely important for poverty reduction. Now, if you look at the issue in African countries, as you've seen, those two green lines were going and converging and meeting. The history of Africa is very different. From independence to the 2000s, those two lines were almost running in parallel. Employment share and GDP share were not converging and allowing a rise in rural incomes moving towards average incomes. So the transformation process has been extremely slow because of that, and the difference between the two shares was almost constant. The consequence was stagnating agricultural income and persistent rural poverty. That is not only affecting the rural areas, but it affects the entire economy. And here is the history of the story in African countries. Thank you for moving that. With stagnating agriculture for most of the 3 to 4 decades post-independence, labor was migrating from that sector to the non-agricultural sector, which had rapidly declining productivity. As the red line shows, labor productivity declining in the non-agricultural sector during the decades of economic stagnation and decline. Agriculture doing a little bit better, but not really very much, almost stagnating. However, labor was still moving out of agriculture into the other sector where productivity was declining. That, for the entire economies, basically was behind what we saw until the recovery started, a decline in total labor productivity and rising poverty rates. And here is what happened to the agriculture itself, which I call the stunting of agriculture. The decline of agriculture in the African countries is much faster than in any other region due to a lot of things, poor policies in the 60s, lacking investment, and disarrays in macroeconomic management in the 80s and 90s, basically agriculture was either discriminated against in the 60s and 70s or left alone without a lot of investment. So what we did here, and this came from work that I did with John several years back, we looked at what should have been the share of the agricultural sector in African economies based on their level of development compared to the rest of the world and the history in the rest of the world. And so the black circles is what the actual share is, and the gray square circle, the gray squares is what it should have been. Invariably, in most African countries, the size of the sector is much lower than it would have been based on the level of development in these economies. So we have just shrunk agriculture at an unprecedented pace. And if you remember the simulation by Macroscan and others, the stimulating impact agriculture should have in the macroeconomic economy was lost to African countries due to that fact. At the same time, the service sector was capturing all that labor, leaving agriculture. Although it is less pronounced here, we have the same thing, but in reverse. The service sector in African countries is, on average, much higher than would have been the case based on their level of economic development. Some of you have seen the statistics, 6% service sector, 40%, 50% service sector in African economies at this level of development, which is a symptom of the stunting of agriculture over 3 decades or 4, and labor being pushed out of agriculture into a low productivity services sector. And I'll come back to this because that what it does has changed the structure of the African economies as we speak right now. And that change in the structure has an impact for future growth and policies. We looked at the stunting of agriculture and how it affected productivity in these countries. We just looked at the correlation. The further you go towards the origin on the x-axis, the higher the stunting of agriculture. So countries with a high degree of stunting of agriculture had the highest poverty levels across Africa. So not only did agriculture fail to grow and create jobs, but stagnation has also kept growth out of the rest of the economy and therefore raising raising poverty rates. So going forward, this will have to change. Now, let's look at the recovery process. Since the 2000s, transformation has improved markedly with recovery. And what we did here, and I should have said that this chapter is co-authored by myself and my colleague Margaret Macmillan, and this decomposition is part of a contribution. So the growth in labor productivity can be decomposed looking at how much is being contributed by individual sectors being more productive over time, and how much is coming from labor leaving sectors with low productivity to sectors with higher productivity. So the reason in this case is sectors raising the productivity, and the structural is labor leaving sectors with low productivity into sectors with higher productivity, which is a structural change process that one would like to see. So to the left of the panel, you've seen that in the 1990s, the movement of labor had an impact that was negative in terms of labor and in terms of productivity. Labor was basically moving from a stagnating agriculture towards a low productivity informal services sector. The change in the 2000s, the movement of labor is adding to productivity because labor is now moving into sectors that have higher and growing productivity. That is the process we would like to see. The healthy economic transformation process combines both individual sectors increasing their productivity and labor moving to relatively low productivity sectors into higher productivity sectors. And it's taking place now in African countries. In the chapter you will see the behavior of labor movements in Africa compared to the rest of the world has become normal in the 2000s. The employment dynamics that took place during the recovery process also shows that things are changing to the better. And this is quite interesting. Look at labor movement in the rural areas. Employment in agriculture is going down. And it's going up in the services sector and in the professional sector. I think I remember once either Tom Jane or Dave Shirley said that, I think it was Tom Jane, that people are moving to towns are now moving to the rural areas. And I think that's what you're seeing here. Labor markets are diversifying a little bit in the rural areas, and people are moving out of agriculture into non-agricultural sectors, even in the smaller towns in the rural areas. And that is both for female and male workers. You also see to the extreme right of the graph that unemployment rates are dropping, both for male, female, and all in general. So the structural transformation process is starting to work the way it should. In the urban areas, it may surprise some. Actually, people working in agriculture are growing, probably from a smaller base. But anybody going around urban areas in Africa, because of the rise of the middle income, increasing demand in the urban areas, agriculture, peri-urban agriculture is actually growing fast. Most of the high-value crops we hear about are being grown around urban areas. But also labor is leaving the service sector into the professional sector. Here too, unemployment rates are dropping slowly, and this is between 2000 and 2012. Okay? So labor is moving, and is moving into sectors that have higher productivity, and therefore the improved transformation process that we have seen, and reduction in poverty rate, as Mark has shown, and other economic improvements we've seen. So the implication of 3 decades or 4 prior to the recovery of post-structural transformation are important and are significant for future growth strategies. What it has done for Africa is that the informal goods and services sector is the largest sector now in African economies. It's not agriculture, it's not manufacturing. It's the informal goods and services sector. It is a large pool of low productivity labor. And it includes what I call proto-industrial activities around wood, leather, metalworks, small mechanical and electrical parts, garments and tailoring, food staples processing, all of which could be targeted by industrialization policies. And the big size of the informal goods and services sector compared to manufacturing and agriculture changes a little bit the conventional approach to industrialization. It's not agriculture versus industry anymore in Africa. It's agriculture and that in-between sector, as Arthur Lewis calls it, and manufacturing. So industrial policies in the future should include measures and investment to modernize this proto-industrial sector through facilitating product sophistication, firm maturation, and enterprise growth. I'll come to that now with the next slide. Next one. So if you look at the informal goods and services sector in Africa, and this is based on case studies and surveys by our former colleagues, Keiji Otsuka and some of his colleagues in Japan, looking at the structure, the characteristic of those proto-industrial sectors I talked about: metalwork, food, woodworks, leatherworks, tailoring and garment, mechanical parts, electrical parts, agribusiness processing. If you look at all of them, what's happening to them right now is that you have a large number of firms producing the same low quality goods which are often imitated. New entrants are added every day and copying the same products, driving profitability down. So that's why you see that profitability curve, the green one, tends down, taking away the capacity to generate surplus and profit to invest in innovation and raising profitability, while the numbers of firms continue growing. We all have seen that woodworkers, they do the same seats, metal workers, the same windows, the same doors, and so on and so forth. Okay. Industrialization in that largest sector, which has activities that lend themselves to product sophistication, that lend themselves to enterprise creation, job creation, should be a core element of future industrialization, not just manufacturing as we know it. And here's how you would do that: modernizing the informal goods and services sector requires what our colleagues call multifaceted innovation and full maturation. The case studies done in Africa and in Asia show that if you want, in that group of enterprises, to avoid the profitability curve going further down and lift it up like the green solid curve cells, and if you want firms to become bigger and smaller in numbers like the solid red curve shows, you'll have to do several things. And history has shown, in the history of Vietnam, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in Ethiopia, here the leather sector and somewhere else, that you need vocational training to improve management practices in those same enterprises. That makes the low quality doors, the low quality hinges, the low quality suits and what have you. You'll have to facilitate technology acquisition and generation. You'll have to create markets for them to be able to sell and expand demand. And most importantly, for them to continue to grow and be able to raise profitability and productivity, invest in infrastructure for telecom and roads, as Maximo Torero will show us in his presentation. Let me go to conclusions. Economic transformation performance is improving among African countries. That's where we are. Productivity raising structural change has started to take place, but decade-long of stagnation has created a bloated informal goods and services sector. So modernizing that sector has to be a key target of future industrial policy, not just industry versus agriculture. It requires and allows us to leverage the large pool of low productivity labor to promote productive quality firm growth in the industrial and handicraft sector, to capture the demand in fast-growing domestic markets, construction, for example, and to raise incomes more rapidly and more broadly and therefore reduce poverty. Thank you. Here are some references for those who would like to follow the work later on. Thanks.